Jane said she yelled at her.
We'll do more. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good evening, slept well, ready for a day of lots of great content. We're going to start off by talking about connectivity in Ukraine during the war, its implications, what we've learned. This is the panel we have set up next to us. Next to me, we'll have a fireside chat with the always fascinating Ben Slivka. Panel on content moderation, whether it's ever possible for government to intervene productively without benefiting politicians. And then we have broadband and more broadband, regulators from all of North America, panel on BEAD and subsidies, and then competition. Remind you about Slido to ask questions. Also, this person, Anonymous, has been asking lots of questions. But just to remind you, if you want, I think you can click the little person symbol on the side to put your name. No reason to do that if you don't want to, but you can. Also, if you're interested in learning about TPI's broadband map, which of course everybody should be interested in, Nathaniel Lovin is outside doing a demonstration, including discussing lots of the things that are on the back end that you can't see on the front. And now I want to hand it over to Ambassador David Gross, who will lead this panel. David.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, and good morning, everybody. It's cold in here, so I think that's designed to wake us up. If you need extra coffee, just let me know. I'll be serving coffee during the session here. This panel is different than the typical TPI panel here at Aspen Forum. It's different in the sense that we're going to focus on a historically important and truly extraordinary time that we're living through, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we're going to take it, because this is TPI and the Aspen Forum, we're going to take it from a connectivity perspective. But I think it's important to begin by remembering and recognizing the extraordinary situation that we see in the Ukraine, an invasion by Russia of a sovereign country in Europe, something that many thought we would never see in our lifetime, something that was not unusual through to basically the end of the 20th century, but many of us thought we would never see this class of problem again. But here we are, in a problem where thousands have been killed, millions are refugees across Europe and elsewhere. Lives have been destroyed, and history is being written as we speak. One of the many aspects of what is happening in Ukraine is that it illustrates many of the issues that we discuss here in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere about the importance of connectivity, the issues about free flow of information, the issues about censorship, the issues about education, and the issues about health and well-beings of individuals and families. So we're going to explore some of those issues with a terrific panel. And it's a little different than normal because we're going to explore this set of issues from a wide variety of perspectives. You'll see our panelists are curated carefully to have very different perspectives on the types of issues. We will have a governmental issue, we'll have a sociological aspect, we're going to have a cybersecurity-related issue, we're going to have a free flow of information issue, and as always, we'll welcome your questions towards the end. As is typical for panels that I moderate, at least, I've asked each of our panelists to give a short, 5-minute or less, introduction to give you a sense of what it is they want you to know, and then I'll have Q&A, and then we'll be turning it over to you all as well for Q&A. With that, Ruth, can you start us off?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up bright and early on this rainy morning to discuss what is a very interesting but also very serious topic. The U.S. government stands with Ukraine, and we are committed to supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. to Ukraine's continued access to the internet, and to enhancing Ukraine's cyber defenses as the country defends itself against Russia's unjust and unprovoked war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just a threat to Ukraine and its citizens, but to Europe more broadly, and indeed to any country supporting the post-World War II rules-based international order. We strongly condemn Russia's actions to block or degrade access to the internet in Ukraine, which serves critical channels for sharing information, including about the state of the conflict. In the near term, this affects the Ukrainian government's ability to respond to Russian aggression, and every Ukrainian citizen's ability to keep in touch and keep track of the well-being of their friends and colleagues outside of Ukraine. However, Russia's interference in Ukraine's information and communications networks is not new. Even before the invasion, Russia had engaged in aggressive cyber attacks in Ukraine and towards other neighbors. The United States has supported Ukraine's effort to achieve telecommunications security and independence for many years. Since 2019, the Department of State has spent more than $40 million helping build Ukraine's civilian cyber capacity, and also working with the government of Ukraine on a national strategy and to stand up a cybersecurity incident response team. And following Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, it became clear that Ukraine's immediate needs differed from its longer-term capacity-building goals. In response, the United States helped establish an informal donor coordination group working with other international partners, and we also drew on U.S. and allied technical experts, the private sector, and U.S. diplomats to engage with Ukrainian authorities to assess and respond to cybersecurity threats. As a result, the international community has surged to support Ukraine's network defenders and telecommunications service providers. There are several lessons learned that we can take from what we've seen as the threats that have happened in their telecommunications sector. The primary lesson is that security, especially network security, is absolutely critical. Another lesson is that sensitive data needs to be secured, but that doesn't necessarily mean localization. In this case, the Ukrainian government stored sensitive data in secure locations in partner democracies, and having this data stored outside of Ukraine was critical to ensuring that they were able to maintain that data. Another lesson is the incredible importance of maintaining access to connectivity, including and especially in emergency and disaster situations. Options like Starlink and other satellite internet providers are useful in keeping countries and citizens connected in a conflict. I would also note that in occupied Ukraine, Russia has made a concerted effort to reroute networks through its territory to better censor, surveil, and control information coming in and out of Ukraine. It shows what lengths authoritarian regimes will go to control these resources, because they know how vital telecommunications and connectivity is to prosperity and fundamental freedoms. In light of these actions, my bureau at the State Department is looking at new mechanisms to leverage services offered by U.S. and Ukrainian cybersecurity companies to support and reinforce the government of Ukraine's own cyber defense and incident response. And as part of the more than $53 billion in Ukraine's supplemental appropriations, the State Department will provide additional cybersecurity support to Ukraine, and we are urgently working to deliver this support. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion, but I will close with saying that in the long term, rebuilding the Ukrainian telecommunications networks offers an opportunity to ensure that these new systems meet the highest security standards and are able to provide equitable access. And in doing so, Ukraine will rebuild stronger, more transparently, and more securely than before. This will enhance Ukraine's digital economy and ICT industry and ensure their freedoms of speech and expression online and offline are strengthened.
Thank you very much. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between government, whether it's the Ukrainian government, the U.S. government, NATO governments, and others, and industry in dealing with some of the cybersecurity issues and the like. But I'm particularly struck, you mentioned data localization, which obviously has been a hot-button issue for many years now on a lot of things. And one of the major lessons learned is how dangerous data localization for governments can be in times of crisis. It reminds me a little bit of the problem that the Japanese had after the tsunami, where they also recognized that because of power issues and others, that having centralized data within their borders was actually more a problem than it was solving. Can you talk to us a little bit about the lessons learned about data localization and the idea of trying to keep particularly government-related, which is often the most sensitive, information outside of the borders using the public cloud or private clouds and the like?
I sure can.
Okay, well, let me ask Ruth
Sure,
first,
yeah.
and then we'll go to Kristen,
Yeah.
and then we'll go right to Kristen for her opening remarks.
No,
as
I mean,
well.
I think we've got some U.S. companies here who can certainly speak to their role in terms of public clouds. But absolutely, I think security of sensitive data is incredibly important to governments, but also to other sort of customers of cloud providers. And I think often there's this idea that if you localize the data, then you have control over that data. But that also means that there are fewer points of failure, which means that, or it's less resilient. So if there is a challenge or something happens to where that data is stored, without having sort of backup copies or having it replicated in other locations, it really puts governments at risk in terms of their continuity of operations.
Yeah, and just to follow on, and then we'll go to Kristen.
Yeah.
One of the problems that became clear in Ukraine was it was reasonably well known which government buildings had data centers, and with smart bombs and the like, the ability of the Russians to target those in order to disable the Ukrainian government was clear, and it was a military imperative. So making sure that that information was geographically diversified turned out to be critically important for the Ukrainian government. Is that, Ruth, is that your understanding as well?
Right, and in a time of conflict with information and telecommunications becoming a true battlefront, it is critical that governments are able to protect their data from deliberate attacks that seek to undermine it.
Right. That's a great intro for Kristen.
Sure, and I'll start by jumping in on the question before I talk a little bit more broadly. I'm Kristen Flynn-Goodwin from Microsoft. I run the digital security unit. We focus on these issues all day. And so what was really significant was the fact that the Ukrainian government and state-owned enterprises couldn't use the cloud. It was legally prohibited under Ukrainian law because of data localization and sovereignty issues. Once President Zelensky declared martial law, then that restriction fell. And within the first 6-7 weeks of the war, we migrated 16 of 17 government agencies of the Ukraine into Microsoft's cloud, and the 17th recently came in as well. So it was essential that the law was changed in order to enable resilience at a national level. And so as we think about data localization, one of the things that we're talking about, we've talked about it with NATO, and from a national security perspective, is it's time to shift the concept of data localization to also include data resiliency, and resiliency at that global or international level under times of significant stress has been a really essential issue for the Ukrainians. When we look back at Microsoft's engagement and support of the government of Ukraine in the time period in the run-up to the war through the first even 6 weeks of it, we had notified the Ukrainian government of over 237 different attacks that we had seen. What was really significant was that the run-up phases were either pre-planning or data exfiltration, wanting to gather as much intelligence as they possibly could about targets. Once the diplomatic solutions began to fail in mid-January, we began to see Russia deploying really aggressive wipers. Sort of think about it like a ransomware without the ability to pay. It's just there to be destructive. So we saw our first wave of destructive attacks in January. We saw our second wave of destructive attacks in February. On the day of the invasion, and in that first 5-day period, we saw 22 different destructive attack efforts coming from the government of Russia against systems in the Ukraine. They were taking advantage of lots of different tactics, most of which did not require Tom Cruise to drop down from the ceiling in a Mission Impossible sort of thing. They were leveraging well-known tactics that we had seen before in order to accelerate. And there are things that people get tired of hearing about in cybersecurity. It's sort of like the diet and exercise types of comments, like make sure that you are updating your passwords, make sure you are patching, make sure that you are not using known exploited systems, because Russia has been attacking Ukraine for so long that these teams have been battling back and forth pre-Crimea, right, pre-2014. So the tactics are well known, the systems are well known, Russian adversaries have been in these networks for a long time. So once the invasion started, we were working very closely with the government to identify vulnerable systems and get them patched as fast as possible or migrate into the cloud. What was interesting is you can separate out the attacks against the Ukrainian government from attacks against allies. So the attacks against Ukraine and its critical infrastructure, that was destructive. Attacks against NATO allies, those involved in the humanitarian or refugee process, those were far more focused on intelligence gathering. And that's common from a nation-state attack perspective. 80 to 90% of the time, nation states are not targeting critical infrastructure. They're targeting people like you. They're targeting think tanks, NGOs, public policy leaders, government officials, because a lot of this attack activity is intelligence collection. It was the same thing in the Ukraine. The Russians are continuing to attack those who are involved in public policy and decision-making of government officials and foreign policy to know what shifts are going to be happening. You see that Russia is also tying in its tactics with physical destruction into disinformation. And Microsoft has talked publicly about how we are seeing Russian propaganda targeting communities in the United States, across Europe, and leveraging different language sets in order to have greater impact and greater stickiness by trying to bring hearts and minds to the Russian perspective. So they are using all of the tools that they have to be really aggressive in trying to bring about a victory. What does this mean from a connectivity perspective? What's fascinating is that the Ukrainians have been incredibly resilient. Starlink has made a huge difference for us to be able to receive information from people on the ground. That's been really essential. The cloud has been really essential. And frankly, signal. So one of the things that's really hard when you're in a wartime environment is having secure encrypted communications. So when you're talking directly to government officials, as we have been throughout because we're doing these direct notifications, we're using secure communications that are not dependent on one company's phone network or looking for modalities to make sure that things are encrypted. So Signal has become the lifeblood for secure communications for a lot of these, and please don't tweet about that widely because, but it's important for us to think about how do we, in times of stress, maintain that interpersonal connection, because when we're responders, we need to be able to communicate, coordinate, and collaborate. I look forward to your questions. I'll stop there.
Sure. No, that's true. Let me ask a really basic question.
Sure.
How did Microsoft get in the middle of this war?
Well, we got in the middle of it because we saw that our customers were being attacked. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was shocking in the beginning of the war was we saw the media kept saying, where's the A-team? Where's the Russians? We expected all this attack activity. And we were drowning in it, notifying the Ukrainian government of all that we were seeing. And so that's why in April we released a pretty large report talking about what we were seeing and the detail of the attack, because we felt it was important that the world understand the depth and breadth of the attack activity that was going on, because the Ukrainians were not in a position at the time to be able to do that themselves. And we were working so closely with them and spotting so much activity, we thought it was important. So we were there from the beginning.
So for those of you who haven't, the April report is not lengthy, so it's very readable, and it's fascinating to read because there's a lot of twists and turns. There's some controversy about the report, but there's still a lot, there's a lot to learn from it. One of the things that came out is, as you just touched on, there's always been this expectation that before a military invasion, as the Russians did on February 24th, that there would be, in essence, a cyber Pearl Harbor type of attack. Is the reason there wasn't something as cataclysmic because of the work that was done in advance and the ongoing work, or was it just a different type of tactic being used by the Russians?
So I think that they were certainly going for that. What was interesting was that in that first wave, and it's included in the report, you can see that they threw so much of their cyber attack capability at the Ukrainians in that first week that we actually saw no net new attack techniques in that second week because they burned them all. I think, when we look back, we assumed that Russia thought they were going to win in the first week, and so they threw everything they had, shock and awe, and that didn't happen. And so then the Russians have had to rebuild and retool and haven't had that effectiveness that we think they had hoped they would have had. But the ransomware or malware that we had seen in January and February, that was designed to be incredibly destructive as an opening salvo. So once the world was onto that, it became a lot harder for them too.
Jamil, that sounds like a good intro to your interests.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ambassador Gross and Ruth and Kristen and Olga and Neil for being on this panel with me. Look, I think that there are some big issues to think about when we talk about connectivity in Ukraine, the role of cyber attacks, the role of information warfare in the modern era. If you think about it from a military perspective, as Kristen correctly points out, the Russians threw a ton of effort at taking down the Ukrainian internet and connectivity early on. In some ways, they were more successful than I think has been publicly reported, right? We've heard a lot about the talks about Viasat and the taking down of internet connectivity for a while. They dropped Ukraine back from, prior to the invasion, about 59th in the world in internet speeds, down to 79th, sort of within the course of the last 7 months. So dramatically slowed connectivity down in Ukraine. We've seen real effects of the Russian activity, more on the infrastructure side, right, than necessarily on the hardened side, where the Ukrainians have been relatively effective. The other story, though, I think, is the importance of this connectivity to the Ukrainian war effort against the Russians, right? We've seen the critical importance of connectivity for coordination purposes, for military purposes, but also, interestingly, for information warfare. The Ukrainians have conducted what I would argue is probably going to be regarded as one of the most successful overt and covert messaging campaigns, right? Influence operations in this conflict in the last 40 years. They've been dramatically successful. Not only have they succeeded beyond our expectations on the battlefield, they've succeeded in the information space against one of the most capable and aggressive information warfare actors out there, the Russians. I think the other interesting aspect of the Ukrainian conflict is this question of spillover effect, right? And so, while we didn't see what we were concerned about, direct Russian attacks, cyber attacks in particular against the United States and our allies, we did see increased intelligence collection, as Kristen points out, right? What we did see, though, was some of the kind of spillover that we worried about after we saw NotPetya. So for those of you that remember, 2017, the Russians conduct a major wiper attack disguised as ransomware against the Ukrainians. That causes a significant amount of damage in Ukraine, yes, but it's the bulk of that effect. The bulk of that attack was felt outside of Ukraine. 4 to 5 American and European companies to the tune of $200 to $300 million of damage each, $10 billion globally, right? We saw similar spillover effects with the Viasat attack, right, into Europe and the like, reducing connectivity speeds across Europe. So it demonstrates the importance of hardening our allies, hardening those that are going to be attacked by our adversaries. There's a lesson here for Taiwan, right, about what we expect the Chinese to do if they go across the Taiwan Straits there. And then I think perhaps the most unsung aspect of the Ukrainian operation and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is the role of the American private sector. Right? We've heard a lot from the Microsoft report about Microsoft and other cybersecurity companies' efforts to harden and defend Ukraine, both in the lead up to the war, but also as the war progressed forward. Right? The important work that State Department and DHS and CISA have done, both in the lead up to the invasion as well as since then. But you also think about, we talked about Starlink already, but let's not forget about YouTube and Facebook. Now, they've come under fire, right? YouTube, as Google has demonetized a significant amount of Russian content, messaging content, and war-related content. Facebook's engaged in content moderation that at times has created controversy here, but has been extremely effective at promoting, I think, the side of this fight that we're all on. Now, we can debate whether, we want platforms to be doing that or not, whether that has 230 implications or not, right? But the truth of the matter is the American private sector has played a massive role in what has been a relatively successful effort and a largely undiscussed effort when it comes to this conflict. And so, I think the one thing to think about is as we consider, in the United States, how to deal with very real challenges with our our technology companies and political debates about that, I think it's worth thinking about the role that our private sector plays in our national security and that of our allies. And we've got to account for that as we think about scale and scope of our modern technology companies and their innovation capabilities, and whether we might be taking off our best actors in an effort to address domestic political issues.
Let me follow up a little bit on that fascinating concept. Yeah, I was so pleased that you mentioned about President Zelensky and his public diplomacy. It doesn't take much to remember that the relationship between the United States and Ukraine has a very long and very difficult relationship. Ukraine is not considered a traditional ally. It has had huge political problems, huge corruption problems over many years. And so it's remarkable in some respects how unified the West is in support of a country that has no real traditional relationship to the West. Part of that is presumably because you have a president who knows how to use the media, an actor who is very facile, but also able to use technology like Twitter and the like in order to communicate very effectively his interest and the interest of the Ukrainian people. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is a piece that is more unexpected. Most of the stuff we've already touched on is the sort of thing if someone had said to you, all right, there's going to be a major conflict, what are the players going to be? Cybersecurity, free flow of information. This piece of it, I think, is a little less expected. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think there's no doubt that our relationship with Ukraine has been challenged at times. It's worth knowing they are a NATO Partnership for Peace country, so we have that sort of built-in sort of capability there. We also, made commitments, as the Russians did, to Ukraine's security in the aftermath of their decision to give up nuclear weapons. But I think President Zelensky and his overt information campaign has not just been successful in convincing political leaders in Europe and in the United States about the need to support Ukraine, but also convincing the average American and the average Westerner, right? They have seen the reality of Russian attacks against civilians, right? They've seen the reality and the heroism, frankly, of the Ukrainian military. At times, a little hyped up, right? And the sort of ace fighter pilot that didn't really exist. But you imagine they're going up against the A team, if not the A- team compared to our team, right? When it comes to overt and covert mis and disinformation. I mean, we saw how effective the Russians were in our elections in 2016. We saw the renewed efforts in 2020 at creating discord in the United States. And yet, the Ukrainians have done a phenomenal job leveraging largely American private sector infrastructure to communicate their message to the globe. Without American infrastructure companies and without the scale and scope of our internet companies, there's almost no chance the Ukrainians would have been nearly as effective as they have been in their global influence campaign.
And isn't it even more remarkable as you just pointed out, the fact that much of that infrastructure was Russian related in the sense that it's Russian companies that were cell phone companies in Ukraine, this long economic relationship, the prior government having been very aligned with Russia. So all the things you would expect. So the fact that U.S. companies have played such an important role in this conflict is, I think, particularly extraordinary, which is a great lead-in for Neil, speaking about major U.S. companies very involved in this.
No, it really is. And I want to maybe echo a few things that Jamil mentioned. First, I had the fortune of being in Davos and sitting with Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov, who leads the technology efforts for the Ukraine, and to see their savviness in the way that they go out to lobby Western countries to really push this message, pretty much echoing everything that you said was in real time, something that I just took away, that they recognize it as a vector of warfare, and the vector of warfare that they must try to control to the best of their abilities for a fear of being overrun by kinetic action on the ground. But that does give me a nice segue, so thank you, David, and I appreciate it. Thank you, TPI, for having me on this panel as well. For those who haven't the opportunity to meet, I'm Neil Potts. I lead our trust and safety policy work at Meta. And trust and safety at Meta, what does that mean? We're the folks who write the rules for what we allow and do not allow. And I have the good fortune of leading a team that focuses on cybersecurity, one that focuses on extremism and countering extremism, one that focuses on human rights broadly, and trying to tie that all together with safety. This tragic situation, I think really to echo what the other panelists have said, the challenges it creates for companies to serve and support those affected by it is real. And it's important for everyone here to understand that we are not only trying to address these issues in real time and dealing with the current conflict, but it's really what happens to the next conflict in the future state, because this unfortunately won't be our last. So at Meta, what does that mean for us? And I'll try to explain that very briefly. I know we're a little bit on the clock, but we've put into place teams who work 24/7 essentially around the clock to do our part to respond to this extraordinary act of aggression. We have evolved our approaches, tried to stay agile, tried to stay nimble to ensure that people using our services can do so safely and securely, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Also, because we deal a lot with harmful content and the content issues, we have to address misinformation, and that's a little bit different than disinformation, addressing that, but also just the broad nature of harmful content, behavior, those actors, so whether they're extremist organizations and the like. But last and not least, really, it's about keeping our services up, and I think that's most appropriate here for this connectivity discussion, because we believe that Meta, our platforms, our services can be a vital tool to unlock information, to unlock resources for people going through this crisis. But when those services are down, obviously it puts a tremendous strain on those impacted. So what does that look like in practice? I guess I would say the first step in ensuring our services continue to provide that support is to keep our users safe. And so I'm an old washed-up Marine. We had a saying, we would say, speed is our security. Essentially, if you move fast enough, they can't shoot you. You move fast enough, it provides a level of stealth. But I think that's really appropriate here, and I think it's not necessarily speed is our security, but privacy is our security, because that speed provided privacy, and I think for our users, privacy is really their security. So our products and services, the vast collections of resources that it can unlock, the connections that it can unlock, that can really help someone through a crisis is very important. But obviously, we want to do that in a private way. So if we can enable people to lock their profile, that we will hide their friends list so their connections can't be targeted. They can hide their location so they can't be targeted directly. These are things that we have enacted and things that we think are very valuable to those that are in the middle of this kind of kinetic action. We've removed those friend lists. We have introduced, even I think, Kristen, you mentioned this as well, Jamil, you said it too, secure messaging ways, whether those are through encrypted services on Messenger, our WhatsApp tool, obviously, even rolling out things like Instagram encrypted messages, because we know Instagram is used widely throughout not only the Ukraine, but Russia, making sure that those connections and those conversations are private so they can't be used for harm. Now, once we have those accounts, locked down and they're secure and people are able to communicate, the next challenge, I think, is really facing, what is the content that we're looking at? Now, we have 30,000 people that work on safety and security at Meta, and that's about half of them really focus on content moderation, including literal content moderators reviewing content. Many of those people are native Ukrainian and Russian speakers that can bring context into the situation to understand how words are used, how terms are used, but it's also making sure that we're evolving our policies in real time, that we address this state that is always just changing on the ground as we speak. But that is only one part of it. So that's the content that we may violate our community standards, we would leave up, we would remove, maybe in certain cases demote. But as was mentioned, the bigger issue here probably is disinformation and misinformation, how we treat that type of content. I think everyone in this room knows it's a huge challenge for social media, maybe Meta specifically, and this is the one that we face in this crisis. So what have we done? We've expanded a lot of our third-party fact-checking partnerships to ensure that we are able to label what is known misinformation. That allows us to demote it in our news ranking feed, and when it actually may lead to imminent harm, we will actually remove that. But even more importantly, that it also provides us an opportunity to provide a warning label and then direct people towards authoritative information so that they can get actual facts, or as we would hope to be actual facts at a moment in time. It's always changing. But it's also important to realize that this problem is global, right? It's not just we all know it's global, but it's not just focused on perhaps Ukraine and Russia, those narrow jurisdictions. There's a huge diaspora through Africa, the Caribbean, through the Middle East that are fleeing Ukraine and returning to their homelands. And we see people being targeted with misinformation, Russian misinformation in their homelands, in their languages. And so our ability to address that is important as well. And this problem really does become a lot more complicated when you factor in things like state media. So state-controlled media and how they operate. You may all have heard that we took some extraordinary actions at the behest of several governments in Europe and the UK, or the EU and the UK specifically, in the Ukraine, where we no longer show RT or Sputnik state media in those jurisdictions. Globally, we have reduced those in those feeds. We do label it so people have an understanding of where that information is coming from, and hopefully they'll be able to make those choices then through a critical lens. And David, I know that's something that you're very focused on. We also do a lot of work on making sure that we are tracking what we call coordinated and authentic behavior. So these are essentially actors with sometimes nefarious, motives, working in a coordinated way to exploit our platform to mislead users across our platforms for various reasons. We've seen this type of behavior not only in the 2016 election, but well beyond before social media was ever invented. It's a technique that Russians particularly love to lean into. We have seen it in these places. We actually removed a couple of networks focused directly on both through Russian nationals and sympathetic Ukrainian nationals working in Ukraine to try to really essentially cloudy up the information battlefield. So those are a few of the highlights that of what Meta has done to this point. I guess maybe if I can leave with a few words, I think while this fight is important right there, obviously, it's really the next fight that we need to prepare to. And I really want us to kind of also begin to focus on what should we do going forward. Because I think, if anything, we see the stark reality, the stark picture of what a divided internet looks like, the security challenges they present, and what authoritarian regimes will do to restrict the flow of free information. In our case, Russia, they banned our services because we started to label their state media, because we were removing their propaganda, because we're allowing Ukrainians to speak freely about their situation. They also threatened our Russian employees with the label of extremist organization for working at Meta and for some of our choices. This is pretty, extraordinary to focus on extraterritorial kind of action against your citizens. But this is a playbook that can be picked up by anyone. I think that's pretty clear. I think we're going to see some other countries, and I'd love to hear some other opinions of countries that would follow the Russian playbook as we see this shift towards like digital protectionism. I guess if I have maybe one comment to wrap it up. It's a crucial moment for democratic governments, companies to stand together, policymakers, the tech companies, to figure this out going forward so that we have the resiliency built into place for the next fight, which unfortunately will be at our doorsteps before too long. That's
Terrific. Thank you. Lot to parse through on that. Before going to Olga, a couple of quick questions. Or one comment is, I'm struck particularly by your comment as an ex-Marine about speed, the importance of speed, but also the importance of privacy. In the discussions to date, there's been a lot of discussion about privacy, but yet also making sure you know who's online, who's speaking, and the tension that comes from that. But the importance of privacy in a war environment or other, challenging environment becomes important. Often for some of us, the idea of privacy was important so you have free speech. On the other hand, physical security is also an important part of the privacy. Is that what you have found?
extremely. I think that idea of physical security, and that's something I mentioned, that lock your profile, we were really worried about in those early days, not only the Ukrainian citizens and those living in Ukraine, but also perhaps those living in Russia that had, just opposition to this attack. What would happen if the Russian government identified them and was able to target them through their location services, was able to target them and leverage their friends and their connections to put pressure on them? What would happen to them? And that's something, obviously going through a litigation or a trial where we were also brought up on potential charges as an extremist organization, really puts into prime focus that there are direct consequences beyond kind of your social media persona of what happens on the offline space. It's all the real world, but what happens in the offline space when the government comes to your doorstep and now wants to question you for your actions online.
And lastly, and you touched on it a moment ago because it's an area which I have particular interest in, the issue from your users. Sure. Part of obviously a lot of play, and you've already touched on it a lot, is the importance of content moderation. How do you identify trusted sources of information, questionable sources of information, and disinformation and misinformation? Can you talk a little bit about what your experience is, not only in Ukraine, but more generally, about the importance of critical thinking by users? How do we go about trying to educate people so that they are critical thinkers about what they read and see on the internet. Learn to Discern is one of the
Right.
programs that I've been involved in, but there are many others as well. Can you speak a little bit to that?
No, and I think that that program, and the way, and we've shared some conversations on that, I think it's something that's just truly important. So, you know, at Meta, we have different ways of addressing misinformation. If the misinformation may lead to harm, we will actually remove it. But if it doesn't necessarily lead, when I say harm, I mean direct imminent harm, physical harm. If it does not lead to that type of harm, we will essentially demote that in our feed. And what we are now doing in many cases is not only labeling that we have this is misinformation, but pointing you in the direction of trying to find out authoritative information on the subject. So I think that is one thing, to educate the user. But where I really love where you are and your organization is focused on, it's not only the tech companies' focus to do, you know, their role to do that, and I think they have a responsibility at some level to try to provide that authoritative information, but it's also the fact of if we can help our users all look through it through a critical lens, through digital literacy, through that kind of common understanding, maybe a liberal arts education, whatever way we want to focus on that, but knowing who the author is, knowing what their intent is, that will help, ultimately help ease the problem. It won't necessarily solve the problem, it will help ease the problem. Make folks question more, I think, is an appropriate way. So reaching it with a level of skepticism is something interesting. I know I was talking earlier to one of our fellow attendees about some studies that were done overseas, and perhaps in other countries, people are much more skeptical of this type of information than they are in the United States specifically. But looking at it from a global lens is really trying to bring in some healthy skepticism into the conversation.
Terrific. Now we're going to go to an award winner in the sense that the person probably involved in this conference furthest away is coming to us from Australia. Olga, can you, hopefully that's a good setup, because I think many of the issues that you've been focused on are some of the things that Neil has just talked about. Olga?
Thank you so much, David. Good morning from Sydney. I'm joining from the land of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. And yeah, it's been a fascinating panel so far, so really an honor to be here. I'm speaking as someone who's number 8 from a list of Australians personally sanctioned by the Kremlin. And so I really would like to kind of extend this conversation on harms and perhaps draw on and expand some of Neil's points on the harms of connectivity. And I would like to approach it from the prism or through the lens of adversarial infrastructure, because this is something that Russia has been actively and deliberately building since its illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 in the occupied Ukrainian territories. So this idea of adversarial infrastructure is one that has the capacity to inflict harm. And usually when we think of infrastructure, when we think of the roads, the bridges, networks, right, connectivity, we always think about it as something positive. However, in these opening remarks, I would like to focus on the weaponization of connectivity in this full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war. And so if you remember the Crimean Bridge, that was a project that drew a lot of attention because it allowed this logistical connection with the territory of the Russian Federation across the Strait of Kerch. There was one more fundamental development, or no less fundamental development at the very least, that largely went unnoticed because it happened deep underwater. And this is something that Ruth was talking about in the beginning of this panel. And this was the laying of the subsea cable that would allow to redirect Crimea's internet traffic to Russia. And so fast forward 8 years, and we're in day 174 of Russia's full-scale war. Russia did not, as if you noticed, it did not deliberately destroy telecommunication infrastructures in the early days of the war. And possibly that was because they expected to use and utilize those communication infrastructures once they occupied the territory, which I guess was a strategic misstep, because that is the communication infrastructure that allowed Ukrainians to mobilize so efficiently and really, really mobilize the population for productive resistance. But in the Russian occupied territories, and we're talking about Kherson, Melitopol, Mariupol, Russian soldiers, as we know, have been visiting the internet service providers to reroute those mobile and internet data through the Russian networks. And also it comes with the whole set of implications of making the experience of using the internet in the occupied territories very similar to that in Russia, so blocking access to Facebook, to Instagram, Twitter, Ukrainian news websites, subjecting Ukrainians in the occupied territories essentially to the same censorship as in Russia, keeping people from receiving truthful information and so on. But also, what's more importantly, it is also subjecting them to unprecedented surveillance. And this is where I guess we have a situation where a similar rerouting of the internet, what Russia is engaged in right now, is historically unprecedented. But if we look from the historical perspective, there have been precedents of an adversary taking over the media environment. We could talk about Germany and the radio and things like that. But the key difference is that in addition to the engineering and the censorship of this information ecosystem, it is really this extent to which the population in the occupied territories can be surveilled. We know there exist filtration camps. We know people are subjected to torture because of something that was revealed in their data. And so this surveillance done through personal data becomes really this key component of adversarial connectivity in Ukraine or in the occupied Ukrainian territories. And it is really deployed as part of the effort at re-engineering the social order to forcefully assimilate the Ukrainian populations into the Russian society. So if we see what is happening through the prism of colonialism, we can see forced deportation of the Ukrainian population into Russia. We can see the separation of children from parents, their placement in state-run institutions. We can see special placement of Russian school teachers in the occupied territories. And once we understand these processes kind of in complex, right, happening at the backdrop, then Russia's actions in the digital realm kind of fit into that bigger picture. And then we can remember that wars are battles for population as much as they're battles for territory. So I guess I would like to end that, of course, in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian territories, connectivity is not adversarial. It is used to tremendous effects, as has been mentioned, to facilitate productive resistance to Russia's occupation. But as is the case with Ukrainian sovereign statehood, rebuilding Ukrainian internet will require capitalizing on this connectivity, on access, on digital rights for citizens, and a really firm turn towards the EU and global free internet, as opposed to the models of the Russian or Chinese intranets. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Well, terrific, thank you, and thank you particularly. It wraps up very nicely, I think, so many of the themes that we've already heard. From your perspective, Olga, there's a question on our Slido here from the person who seems to write all the questions, Mr. Anonymous or Miss Anonymous, who asks the question about is the message coming out of Ukraine, the message coming from the government of the Ukraine, is it, it's having a major impact in the United States. It's had a major impact, we believe, in most of Europe. From your perspective, in your professional view, is it having a similar impact elsewhere in the world, in the developing world and elsewhere? Many of us have been struck, and Ruth, maybe you can talk a little bit to this as well. We're struck by the fact that although Europe and the West have condemned Russia in the most strongest terms possible, you don't see the same condemnation of an invasion of a sovereign country from much of the G77 and the other unaligned countries. Maybe you could speak a little bit to the messaging piece you see from your research.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it depends on the media environment largely in which a lot of these countries operate. The message is definitely coming through here in Australia. However, we need to remember that Russia for the past maybe 10 years has really invested a lot into supporting these RT, Sputnik, these other media channels that actually quite successfully operate in many of the Gulf states, elsewhere. And so right now it really becomes a matter of whether some of these channels get sanctioned, whether people will still have continued access to those information channels. It also is not as simple as just sanctioning channels, right? Because we now see that there's the curious kind of bleeding through of the Russian propaganda narratives, and you can find them anywhere where there's former Russian journalists. As we know, some of the very prominent Russian journalists now successfully work for many Western channels. We can also see Yeah, so it depends. We can also find them in the Amnesty International reports and elsewhere. So it is not as simple. It is already much more complicated than just kind of limiting the spread of propaganda using those Russian infamous channels, and that is what makes it so complex. But that is actually what really serves to generate support for Russia in this war.
Terrific. Ruthie, can you maybe comment from a State Department perspective what you see globally on this?
I think it's a good question, and I think to think about whether the message, the Ukrainian message is landing, it's also important to realize that Russia is also engaged in its own counter-narrative. And I think one area we really saw that was the issue around food security, where there was a very active attempt at misinformation and disinformation regarding the reasons for food insecurity, particularly in Africa. But I do want to touch on sort of one thing that was raised by Olga, and that's sort of thinking through how the companies and the countries where they're headquartered who build, operate, and maintain critical telecommunications networks are something that need to be considered as a potential source of vulnerability should there be conflict. And so as Ukraine thinks about rebuilding its telecommunications infrastructure, I think it's really important that they work to ensure that they're using vendors and suppliers that are trustworthy and that they have a secure supply chain. And this is something that the United States has been very vocal on in terms of ensuring that your telecommunications networks are not built by companies who are headquartered in authoritarian regimes because of the potential vulnerabilities in a future conflict that could create. And I think the Ukraine example is a very good one, and I hope that countries, including particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, take notice as they think about building out their next generation networks. Of course, Huawei, which is a PRC-based vendor, has a lot of market share. We've heard a lot from carriers about the lower cost solutions, but companies, customers, and governments should really think about the potential trade-offs. And so I think that's an important example to take forward as a lesson learned from this conflict.
Jamal?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and it highlights the importance of the United States and our allies having strong companies in this space, right? Whether it's telecommunications, right? Whether it's internet connectivity, and we talked about Digital Bridge and their capabilities yesterday, but also our platform companies, right? And the importance of us maintaining that innovation and that capability here in the United States and growing that, right? There's an ongoing conversation in our country about whether and the role of the government in supporting industries and providing both financial and economic incentives to industries that are critical to our national security. There's also debate about how we deal with some of the political issues around those industries. And I think we have to keep in mind, both in terms of the spending and the regulation aspects, right, the importance of that having these companies here in the U.S., here in the West, and having them be able to sell their capabilities around the globe to allies and the like is critical. I mean, you look at what the Russians did in Ukraine when they took certain cities and they rerouted all the data from those cities back into SORM, right? So if you wonder what a Chinese invasion of Taiwan looks like or Chinese influence in Africa looks like, the scenario where Huawei controls telecommunication networks around the globe is a disastrous scenario for America, and the same is true when it comes to internet connectivity. The same is true when it comes to internet platforms. We do not want to drive this innovations capability out of the United States, and yet that seems to be a very small part of both the regulatory and incentives conversation, chips being perhaps a case in point on the opposite side of it, but it seems to be a very small part of the conversation, one that we really need to focus on, the importance of our national security of maintaining that innovation in those companies here.
Kristen?
Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Well, just respond very quickly. But no, I agree completely. And the U.S. government is very focused on how do we foster and enable innovation in this space, including new network architectures. Because I think everyone would agree that there is not enough resiliency or diversity in the telecommunications supply chain, which is why there's a lot of effort being put into open radio access network or open RAN network architectures. And I think the CHIPS funding provides really critical resources to the Department of Commerce under the Public Wireless Innovation Fund to really help accelerate these new network architectures, which also create space for U.S. companies, not just in the ICT network infrastructure, but also in the services and the software that run on top. And so we really do see this as an opportunity to help U.S. companies be more competitive in this space.
But it's important to click down one level. So Russia was looking at data centers as a part of its attack methodology, that was not looking successful for them. So what did they do? They compromised Schneider Electric and other companies involved in power and HVAC and control systems, industrial control systems, so that if you can't disable the data center directly through one of the big providers, go after the control systems that can then have an effect on the ability to continue with telecommunications or continuity. You know, obviously we've got HVAC running right now because we're all freezing. You know, imagine if we could manipulate that. And so when you think about resiliency in telecommunications, in cloud, in any of the critical infrastructure services, it's important to go 1 or 2 clicks down, because it is far easier to compromise those smaller providers that are a part of that supply chain. And that was a part of the Russian conflict in Ukraine, outside of the Ukrainian theater, and just wanted to push on that here.
Neil, I'm going to give you the last word.
I don't know if I have anything else to add to it. I do agree with the idea of enabling and empowering U.S. companies to continue to operate in the space to be able to provide those services abroad.
Terrific. And let me end by thanking Olga particularly. Now, Olga, you can go to sleep. It's like midnight, after midnight in Sydney. So we really appreciate your extraordinary efforts to be with us today. And I think we should all thank this extraordinary panel for an insightful session.
Okay. And do not start until. All right. This is for